This interview today is very fascinating. It's with Craig Leduc. I think you're going to get a lot out of it from him winning several national championships with his debate team. It wasn't with a huge school, it was with Southern Utah University, a little school, but they were taking on and beating the Harvards and the Stanfords and the Princetons, and they were beating them. It's really cool. And later on in life, he explains kind of his life story, but then we get in depth on him being a franchise owner and how he got into it, how the deal was structured, how the entities work together, and it's very fascinating. So if you're looking at possibly becoming a franchise owner, a franchisee, or franchising your business, I think this interview is going to help you a lot. Without further ado, here it is. I also want to apologize because our video cut out during, we still have the audio, but the video cut out. So you're just going to see our pretty little faces up there for the duration of the interview. So here it is. Well, thanks so much, Craig, for joining me today on this interview. I'm really excited. We've known each other for, what has it been? Maybe a year and a half? No, maybe a little more, 2 years or so, right?
Pretty close, yeah.
Yeah. And just over the years, as we've talked a little bit more, what you have done, being involved in business and going into the franchise with Schooley Mitchell, and now just recently exiting. It's been very intriguing. So I'm really excited to sit down with you today. I think the people that are watching are going to get a lot of good advice from you, and you're just a fun guy to listen to as well. You're just super entertaining. So I'm excited.
Back in high school, college, I was fortunate enough to actually have the same debate coach in high school who later took over the college program, but he had a sign up, and I'm sure he wasn't the first one to do it, but anyhow, it was, if you can't dazzle them with brilliance, baffle them with BS. So,
I love that. Well, you're definitely it's there are some people that do give BS. I feel like what you give is genuine. It's really good. So I'm just, thank you for joining me today.
well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Let's get started with kind of your upbringing of, like, who were you in high school, and kind of going kind of through your career. I'd love to kind of hear that story.
Okay, well, we actually moved. I grew up in the Sugar House area of Salt Lake, but we moved into what was then the outer suburbs, which now is like right in the middle of town. But we moved out into the South Jordan area, and so I actually did my junior and senior year at Bingham High, knowing virtually no one. I mean, I just kind of stepped in cold. It was awkward, but I was fortunate enough. I mean, I came from a very middle class, blue collar background, had really no designs on college or anything in that direction business wise. I mean, my dad had worked for somebody else as a laborer. I saw myself going that direction. I was good in school, bored with school, and I happened to have a debate coach that junior year that he looked at my schedule and said, "No, this is changing." I'm like, "What are you talking about?" He says, "No, no, no. Nobody competes for me that isn't giving 110 everywhere they're at." Now, I would argue that you can't be 110 at everything all the time, or you're going to burn yourself out. But the point was, push yourself, right?
Yeah.
So he fundamentally changed my professional trajectory. And it wasn't just me. We took the whole squad. I mean, he was that way with all of these middle class kids who were kind of like, yeah, we're just here to have a little fun. And we won state championships. And then he took over my college program after my freshman year. And, dinky little Southern Utah State, who at the time was even a college, not a university. And, we were taking out USC and UCLA and whatnot.
Really?
And it wasn't, I don't say that to brag, because it was what it was. And we almost got to the point where we took it for granted. But the point was that was a pivotal time, not just in my life, but several others, because ML, that was our coach, was very good at helping us to see what life could be. And his standard, if you will, was called standards of excellence. And everything was measured by not necessarily how you competed against someone else, but how did you compete against yourself? To the point that we got so used to winning tournaments that in 2.5 years at the college level, we actually lost one to BYU. But some of the kids on our squad had never, they didn't know what losing was like. We hadn't lost. They just started taking for granted that we would beat everybody we saw. So when someone beat us, those of us that had been around a while stood up and gave BYU a standing O. And we're grabbing these guys by the collar and pulling them up and saying, and they're like, we don't get it. Why? They just beat us. Why would you cheer them? I said, because if they're good enough to beat us, they deserve a standing ovation. And it wasn't arrogance, it wasn't cockiness, but it was just this concept that if you're giving everything you can give and doing everything you can do, by dang it, celebrate the ones that are doing the same thing. And so, you mentioned earlier that BS is not my strong suit. Throughout my career, everything I've done has always been about how do I elevate my client, my prospect, my business, So even when I was selling, it was less about selling and more about what do I bring to their business? How do I bring my talents, the goods and services that I represent, how do I bring those to help that business achieve their goals, their dreams? And that's really, like I say, I'm not quite sure where I adopted that or how I adopted that beyond that high school and college with that coach was very transformational for me in terms of going from it's about me to it's about something bigger.
For sure. That's really cool. I had no idea that you guys were in the national championship, or did you guys win the national champ? How did that?
So the way that was all set up was kind of, there were probably 10, 12, 15 tournaments on the year.
Okay.
And sweepstakes wise, that is total squad victory. We would win those based on accumulated points. And then, depending on who my partner was or wasn't, I mean, we won several individual, well, I say individual team first places. I was top speaker, I don't know, 4 or 5 tournaments a year kind of a thing. We actually, based on accumulated points, I guess it was a vote or something. And so among schools our size, we were number 1. Among all schools across the country, we were number 2.
Wow.
So, yeah, and this was, like I say, just dinky little Southern Utah State.
For sure. That's such a cool accomplishment. And for debating as well.
It was fun, and I don't want to dwell on this one, and I know you're going to edit it, or hopefully you're going to edit it out. But I mean, the first time we went back to nationals before SUSC really had the reputation. Our first 2 rounds at nationals were Harvard and Princeton, and I'm not sure who was more surprised coming out of those rounds, them or the judge.
Really?
Because we took both of them.
So let me ask you this, because that's like Harvard, Stanford, the people that are going there are super smart, super on top of things. How did you guys get up to that level? Were you guys just as smart, or was it a strategy thing? Like, how did you guys outwit those guys or beat those guys?
So, and it's true of athletics. It's funny because none of my kids went that direction. They were all athletes. And so I chose to carry on the legacy, and I coached them through most of their recreational ball, right? And I'm sitting there with how to play basketball for dummies in one hand and coaching essentially with the other. But the point of it is while skills are important, raw intelligence is certainly important, but specifically to where we're going with it. What I've noticed is that people that succeed in business, whether they run their own businesses or they run businesses for someone else, has very little to do with raw intelligence. It has everything to do with belief. And so when I take that back to what ML was able to accomplish with us in both high school and college, yes, we went to the clinics, we went to the things that helped us learn how to do it. But it was more about why we did it, who we did it for, and a belief that we could. And that was probably where ML was better than anybody I've ever encountered, was helping us to understand that where we came from had nothing to do with where we were going. And that, we were capable, just as capable as the next one. And so it was more that conviction, more that belief, if that makes sense.
For sure. I really like that. You could post that on your wall. Success has little to do with raw talent and has everything to do with belief. That's really cool. So
Well,
going,
yeah,
yeah, continue.
No, I was just going to, in business, and I've spent probably 25 years of my total career, no, actually longer than that, but I won't tell you how old I am. But let's just say it's been a long time. But most of that time when I'm working with other businesses, I mean, honestly, I'm scratching my heads at some of the successful ones because I'm going, this guy's an idiot. But he just doesn't flat out believe that he can be stopped. And so he keeps making dumb mistakes, but his people love him, or he keeps not this, but this happens or that happens. And I mean, really, some of the ones that have been done phenomenally well, for me to have just interviewed them or just watched them, I'd have gone, not a chance, not
Really?
a chance. But they were totally in that realm of, I can't fail. And when you don't believe you can fail, you've heard the adage, if you didn't believe you could fail, what would you try?
Yeah.
And that's just simply how they approach things. The idea that they could fail wasn't even an option. Now, it doesn't mean they didn't bloody their nose a time or two, but they didn't see that as the end. They just saw that as a learning experience. So again, it is absolutely attitude over mechanics. Now,
Yeah.
you need the mechanics and you need to be able to fine tune, but that's typically where I came in when I was working with them. Is I just, okay, here's where you're trying to get, here's what you're doing. So here are the key performance indicators. Here are the best practices. Here are the whatever
Sure.
that will help you get there. But it was more a matter of just shaping.
Sure. And you can teach those things. You can teach the X's and O's of what to do, but the belief you're talking about, the why somebody's doing something, that isn't something you can teach. That's something they have to choose, and it takes time.
Yeah,
right?
In fact, you bring up a good point. And I would tell, if I was working with HR managers, or I was working with a small store owner and he's hiring or whatnot, with restaurants, invariably they'd get this chef that had all the credentials in the world. And Craig, what do you think of this one? I'm like, really? Why'd you hire that guy? And they're like, oh, well, look at his resume, And I'm like, okay, we'll look at the resume differently, and I don't want to get into the nitty gritty of this one. But the point was, they were hiring for skill set. If you've read Covey's 7 Habits, he talks about heart set, mindset, and skill set. Now, skill set is just what it sounds. But if you're not hiring a brain surgeon, or you're not hiring a specific trial lawyer, for most of the things that most of us do, we teach mechanics. Mindset's a little trickier. Mindset really does, to one degree or another, require changing how you think in terms of what a win is. But it's still coachable. It's still teachable.
Yeah.
Not as easily as a skill set, but it can be done. But the one thing that, there's an exception. I know a guy who runs a really brilliant program that's capable of working on heart set. But for the most part, heart set isn't teachable. And what I mean is, you're either an introvert or an extrovert. And depending on the position, some work in some areas, some work in others. The ability to get out of bed on time, whether they're predisposed to addictions. I mean, there's all these kinds of things that to me fall under this idea of heart set. Heart set's about character, if you will.
Yeah.
You can't hide, I mean, you cannot teach character. Well, like I say, having said that, I know somebody that does.
Yeah.
But point being, generally speaking, you can't, and it takes a lot of time.
Sure. And the person also has to be willing to change, and it's like you said, it's a lot of work, and so you can't just hire somebody that's, let's say, the chef. It sounds like he was kind of arrogant, like, oh, I know what I'm doing, I have all these credentials, and he's not teachable. Then it's like you can't just change that. It's not like a recipe you can just give him and he can just follow the recipe, right?
And that's a more obvious example, but we would see it all the time. So I would tell hiring managers, I would tell, I mean, let's face it, if you're a small business, you're wearing 20 hats. You're the hiring manager, you're the training manager, you're the grunt, you're everybody, right?
Yep.
But point being, I would say quit looking at skill set first on the resume. Right now you're going through 50 resumes and you're throwing out everybody that doesn't, look good and smell good. No, take the time to figure out where they've been, how long they've been there. Is loyalty a factor at that point? Make the phone calls. How did they do? Why did they leave? Because what you're really looking for is that integrity. You're looking for that character. And so there again, going back to your original question, how were you guys able to succeed? He found people that wanted to make the journey, i.e., give the 110 or I don't even want to invest my time in you. He was looking for that heart set. And then he was able to help us shift our paradigms in terms of how we saw ourselves, how we saw our school. And then when you apply the skill sets to all of those things, we were unstoppable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really cool story. How did you take that into, tell us a little bit about your career leading up to getting into this franchise. I know we talked about it a little bit, but go ahead and tell us about that story after college.
Yeah. So we'll do the real abbreviated Reader's Digest version. Most of you don't even know what Reader's Digest is anymore. But point being, I spent 10 years coming out of college. I was recruited by, at that point, the largest retailer in the country into their management program. And it was either that or I had a graduate assistantship to a top program. But I chose business over education, thinking that actually there was a distinction between the two. Over the years, I've come to figure out that yes, I'm in business, but I'm first and foremost a teacher. But anyhow, point being that I did that for 10 years, and that gave me a strong background in operations. And by that, I mean how everything came together. Yes, I was on the floor selling. Yes, I was teaching my people how to sell. I was teaching my people how to perform their functions. But on the back end, I had to understand how payroll integrated, right? I mean, you don't have a lot of controllable expenses when it's all said and done. One of them is payroll, and the other is what you pay for the goods, or at least how many goods you buy. I mean, those are the things or rather how much you charge for those things. But point being, that's about as much control as you have in the revenue stream. And so it's, but you had to find that out through a lot of trial and error. I mean, if I'm 15% of sales and my margins are tight and this and that and the other thing, a 1% difference in what I pay somebody or how much payroll I have may be the difference between, an extra 10 or 15% in terms of my profit margin. And all of those things integrate. But the beauty of that 10 years is it allowed, even though I was working for someone else, it helped me to understand how operations work and why they work. And I want to tie that back to what we're talking about. You said, hey, I specifically want to get to franchising, and I want to keep moving back in those directions. But the idea that this journey, how did it help prepare me for that, if you will?
Yeah.
So the beauty of high school and college is ML literally turned me into a player coach. I was not only competing, but I was teaching others how to do that. So
Mm.
I captain of the Oxford teams in high school, captain of the cross examination teams in college and whatnot. So
So he was teaching you and probably others how to be leaders as well, and he was
you
duplicating
know,
leaders.
and then duplicating it. And so, and obviously 10 years in retail kind of perpetuated that process because, again, one of the things in business, whether you're running your own business or whether you're running someone else's, there's only so much you can do. And anytime somebody says, I'm indispensable, this place would die without me, I would usually look at them deadpan and say, then you're doing it wrong. Pull your head out of your butt. Because if you haven't duplicated if you haven't, if you don't have people you can trust, then, you're guaranteed to be there 80, 100 hours a week, which we do enough of anyway.
Yeah.
But if you don't have somebody to lean on, if you're only as good as you are smart, you're done before you get started. The key really is to create a culture of collaboration, of cooperation. And it's tough to do that if you see yourself as the only rock star.
Mm-hmm.
So anyhow, so that kind of prepared the foundation for those. Stop. Okay, where see, now I'm off in a rabbit hole. I'm off on a tangent. Pull me back. Where are we trying to be?
Yeah, so you just talked about how you're 10 years worked for the biggest retailer in America. And where did you go after that? And you were learning how to do operations, payroll, sales, all that kind of stuff. Where did you go? What were the next couple of steps leading up to the franchise?
So I stepped away from there. I mean, one thing you kind of you peak out in terms of the income potential. The other thing is, man, anybody that can make it retail, I bow to them because it's high stress, it's high. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm 6'1".
why is that? Because profit margins are so low, or what? Why is that?
Well, one thing, profit margins are low, but the biggest thing is it's a meat grinder. You're there's always somebody calling in sick that you can't find anybody to cover. You're turning an awful lot of goods on a small margin, so things are tough. And it's changed a little, but it hasn't changed a lot. But gosh, and it's where do I begin? But it's very much a culture of what are you doing for me today? And and actually this makes sense, and you can edit this out later. We can have it for another conversation or whatever. But there's two ways to manage, and one is by negatives and the other by positives, right? Now, negative will work to some degree or another. I mean, the idea that there's pain, either you have a paycheck or you don't, or whatever, can work in very short-term situations, and it can work in very specific situations. And I'll tie this back to the debate coach because while I was coaching, particularly in college, he and I would both ride in the front of the van going on these 15, 16-hour road trips. And I'd never been able to figure out as a competitor why I didn't see certain ballots. Until now I'm going through the ballots for half the squad and deciding which ones they get to see. Because if there were very personal negative attacks that would probably cut to the core of where they were or who they were, they never saw them. And no, you take those and you put all of that to work. And then in the course of the next 2 weeks before the next tournament, you work with them on those things, but you never let them see what this jerk said. Because we have years of investment in these people, and we're not going to let the occasional judge blow them out of the water. That's how much he believed in positives. The shock for me was when I got into retail and realized that it was mostly negative.
Really?
And the reason was everybody's fighting for promotion, right? So you come into a store, you're the new store manager. Well, invariably, everything the other guy did, he was an idiot because you're trying to prove him wrong.
Yeah.
And there was a tendency to hammer the employees, to push productivity. So I'm not giving raises. I'm not giving encouragement. By fear, I'm getting them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. And you can produce short-term productivity gains. Well, if I can be a splash in that store for 5, 6 months, and I can produce incredible numbers that give me a wonderful bottom line at year end, well, I'm going to get promoted. And so what happened in retail is there was a tendency to promote somebody well beyond their level of competence. In most business environments, we talk about this rising to the level of incompetence. That you're going to rise to the level of however good you are based on the skill sets you have, and then it's going to be up to the company to provide additional training or opportunities for that growth, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
You see it in salespeople that for 9 months or a year would just kill it, and then all of a sudden they plateau. Now, when I work with salespeople, you'd get guys that would get comfortable with a certain income. 50,000, 60,000, 100,000, whatever it was, and they'd stop when they got to the income they wanted, and they would just maintain that. Okay, great. But when you had guys stopping at well under their potential, you could go into that market and tour with them and figure out that what they had done was they had sold everybody that they could relate to, or they'd sold every product in their inventory that they knew about, but they weren't selling the others. And so usually when I would go into a market and look at salespeople, I was looking for one of two things. Do they not have the heart set, in which case they should never have been hired? In other words, have we failed them because we should never have hired them? Or are we failing them because we haven't given them the adequate training to move to the next level? So that was one of those things that 10 years taught me. And so when I moved into the next area, I actually went into sales. I was a distributor sales rep, did that for 10 years in the lawn and garden sector, and then I did it for 15 years in food. You go, wait a minute, well, you're selling chemicals in both areas, but hey. But the principle stayed the same, even though they seem like utterly different environments, and they are. The success patterns were the same. The operations, the numbers might switch. I remember when I'm sitting there with the vice president of sales for this one independent food company. And and I've got through the district manager, I've got through the regional manager, and now I'm with the national sales manager. And he's going, Craig, he says, I've looked at 11 guys and none of them have less food experience than you do. He's like, gulp, right? Now, my response was just, I figured at that point, what have I got to lose? I just, well, hire a chef, but you better hope you can teach him to sell, or you can hire me and I'll learn food. But the point was, I get the job, and now I'm like, oh, crap, now I got to deliver on not knowing any of this.
For sure.
But when I met my supervisor for the first time, well, actually the second, because he interviewed me the first time. But I just said, okay, I need to know two things. And the rest of this I'll pick up as I go. What's food cost, or where should their food cost be, and where should their payroll percent be? Because if I know those two things, I know whether they're making money or not. And so he gave me those numbers, and then sure enough, I learned all the details about what needs to happen on the back end, and what constitutes a good steak and what doesn't, and all of those things. But it was that operations side of it that will make or break it. And so I applied the things I learned in that 10 years of retail to working with all of these independents. And that pulls up a point in terms of why a franchise or not a franchise. So what's your background going in? What are you trying to accomplish? And so when I looked at this third-party expense reduction company, who I won't mention again because names really don't matter. But point being, it was all right. What can the franchise bring to the table for me that either, in fact, it actually starts with what can I bring to the client that they can't do for themselves? Because otherwise, I'm just a BSer. I'm just a parasite. I've always believed that if I cannot deliver more to my client than they pay me, then I've missed the point.
For sure.
I always have to be a value add, right?
Yeah.
But then by the same token, whatever my service is, has to be something that they do. And when I looked at franchise versus starting on my own, I remember everybody going, Craig, you're a great cook and you coached restaurants for 15 years. Why didn't you open a restaurant? And because I've coached restaurants for 15 years and I know better.
Yeah. That's a tough industry to get into.
I had a trucker one time. Hey, I'm going to semi-retire and I'm just going to open some place that serves good trucker food. I said, then you're not retiring at all. You just took on two jobs.
Yeah.
Well, what do
Yeah.
you mean? I said, if you open, you'll find out. Can I talk you out of it? No. I said, then let's just get it done and I'll do the best I can. But anyhow, it's another tough business. But I obviously would have had the skill sets. I would have had the relationships. I would have had everything I needed to go in and make one successful. I just did not want to do that business.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is I wouldn't have joined a franchise at this point. There would have been no reason to. If I'd have done anything, I'd have gone on my own and independent. But the question that anyone asks themselves or should ask themselves when they go into business, what do I bring to the table? You know, what can I do that is either not being done in the market or it's not being done well, or that I'm going to be doing it differently? And let's use the restaurant example. You go out wherever you go out, and if I asked you to say what's your favorite restaurant, you would tell me. And if I said why, it'd either be exceptional service or it would be you'd love the atmosphere, but more likely there's going to be something on that menu that you can only get there, or they do it better than anyone else does.
Yeah.
Well, those are the questions you need to be asking yourself when you're talking about going into business. You guys, your heart of country swing. You looked at St. George, says nobody's doing this, and people would have a lot of fun, and we can teach this. So you didn't need a franchise. You brought everything you needed to bear. But a lot of people, particularly depending on the industry, don't have all the pieces. And so when you're deciding whether or not you're going to franchise, the point of a franchise is you're getting an operational model that already works.
Yep.
Ideally, everyone's
Yep.
already figured out what works, what doesn't. So you have best practices, you have an operations model, you have all of the pieces
Yeah.
together, what they call a turnkey business.
Sure. So what
And
what do they need you for? Is it just capital and then a good leader to make sure that the systems are being followed? Are those the two main things that they need as a business in a franchisee? Or are there other things? What are they looking for in
sure,
you?
when you're a franchise, when you're a franchisee, what the franchisor obviously is looking at is one, can you generate revenue for me in a given area where I don't already have revenue? In other words, they're not going to pay for the same service twice.
Yeah.
So, so can you leverage my model in an area that I'm not already at, right? And the beauty of being a franchisee is that the costs are all on you and they're just taking a percentage of your success. It depends on the model. Everything's a little different. I mean, if you were to start a popular fast food chain right now, I think your upfront investment's 2 or 3 million. But the guaranteed rate of return is there because everything is set up.
Sure.
The franchise that I joined gave me access to information that I didn't already have. But the marketing, the selling, all of those things were still primarily on me. Now, my upfront cost was, 150,000, not 2 or 3 million.
Yeah.
But as a result, there were a lot more variables in play that landed on me.
And how did you find this franchise?
There was a franchise. I mean, they'll call them franchise coaches, but you can find organizations that do nothing but present franchise operations to potential business people. So somebody had looked at my LinkedIn page, and I had indicated that I was, ready to start something on my own, that I'd had enough of corporate America, and, it was time to make a shift. And so I actually had several reach out to me.
Mm.
And so it was, okay, so they interviewed to find out what are your skill sets, what are your passions, what are you looking for, not looking for. And then they brought 3 or 4 opportunities to me and said, hey, this is what we like on this one, this is what we like at this one. Excuse me. And so I went through them, and The one that made sense for me made sense on the basis of, okay, I understand operations, I understand expense control, but I don't have the tools and resources to do the nationwide comparisons of rates from individual providers, nor do I have the leverage to be able to go after it. Plus, I don't have the institutional knowledge to know what I'm looking for. We had one client, and I'll use this as an example, but we were looking at their telecom pricing, or rather, I should say that, my analysts were. They needed me to go out and generate new business, then they would do the analysis.
Gotcha.
Right? So I get a call from the analyst, I don't know, a week or two in, and he's, Craig, you're going to love this one. Now, this was a 15 location chiropractic operation. I said, how's that? He said, well, they bought a leased telephone system 3 years ago. All right, okay. I mean, yeah, right? Yeah, you're doing the same thing. Yeah, okay, so they bought one.
Yeah.
He said, no, the contract on these leases, the reason you lease is for tax advantage. Because if you buy the equipment outright, it's amortized over 10 or 15 years. But if you lease it, you get to take the whole thing up front.
Oh, wow.
Because it's a lease.
Yeah. That's smart.
Now, none of you quote me on that if you're doing, working with the IRS, because I'm not an expert.
You gotta talk to your
at the time, right?
Talk to your CPA.
Yeah. So that being said, he says, but here's the thing. After a year, they should have been able to buy it out for $1, for $1. He said, they're still paying $5,000 a month in leasing fees. Because the company that sold them this didn't bother to go back and say, oh, by the way, if you want to quit charging us for the lease, you can own the equipment. And so we were literally able to go in and save them $5,000 a month just on that. But my point is, here's the three things the franchise bought. Institutional knowledge that I didn't have. Databases that could make comparisons in anywhere in the country on any type of service within the telecom realm. And then, beyond that, the negotiating power. We all have walked into it to somewhere, and when we buy a single item, our price is this much. We buy a case, it's this much. If we bought a pallet, it would be this much, right? And so it's that, economy of scale. So
Sure.
By virtue of the fact that we had 20,000 active clients, it gave us negotiating power when it came to getting pricing for the individual client that exceeded their ability to leverage that on their own.
Gotcha. So if I understand the business model, it's you go in to a client, they're business owners, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you say, let us look at all your expenses and see if we can negotiate some of these things down. And then whatever you negotiate down or you eliminate or whatever, then you keep half of what they would have been paying, right?
Yeah, for a limited period of time.
For a limited time.
There's a company here in St. George that let's see, what were we averaging? Their savings per month was $30,000-$40,000 average.
Wow.
So needless to say, that's a nice client, but when they get to the end of that 3 years, they go, we don't need you anymore, sayonara, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. So you put in 150,000. What was your how did you get the money? Was it your own cash? Did you go and get a loan? How did that work?
I had, when I left the company I was with, I had a certain amount of liquid cash from 401k, one thing or another, that's how I chose to reinvest. And then I also needed to take out some loans for operation. I mean, I was able to basically buy the franchise.
Sure.
What I had, but operating a franchise. And this is the thing. And again, everything's different. And I'll give you an example of that here in a second. But I would typically tell clients that we're getting ready to open, whether it was a new farm and feed store, or a new restaurant, wherever I happen to be working with someone, is that understand that for the first 2 to 3 years, you're going to be figuring out everything to do right versus wrong, right? Now, franchises help take that sting away, but for the most part, if you're an entrepreneur, and you've been there, how
For
much do
sure.
we have to charge? How much do we have to make? What's the ideal amount of people we can handle at any given time? So profitability, revenue is one thing, but what you actually keep at the end of the day is something else, right?
Yep.
And so you do most of your mistakes, most of your learning in that first 2 to 3 years. Then after that, you've started to figure out what the best practices are, what the things you want to avoid are. Now it's a matter of scaling what you have. So, do I have the people in place to scale directly? Do I turn around and franchise out the operation? How do I grow from here? Do I want to grow from here? So, profitability comes in that next 2 years. But and these numbers have not changed a lot. 80% of all small businesses fail of all types, franchises, of independent, whatever it might be. 80% fail in the first 5 years.
Hmm.
And of the remaining 20%, 80% of those fail over the next 5 years. So at the end of 10 years, 4% of the people that started on this day are still in business. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean every one of them failed per se. They may have sold off or one thing or another, but that's how edgy, if you will. That's how competitive. That's how
For sure.
frustrating it is. And I'll say you've experienced it. I've experienced it.
For sure. For sure. Yeah.
And
If you don't
invariably,
if you don't know what you're doing, you're gonna get beat out, and or you're just gonna get tired of it and say, I just want to go do a job. It's a lot
yeah.
easier.
And it was very frustrating for me because I spent, oh heck, by that point, I think I'd been, 25, 30 years running other people's businesses or coaching other people in how to run their businesses. So, I'm
Hmm.
not going to have these problems, right? I've already got it figured out. I'm just going to step into this and it's all going to work. No, it's like there must be some small business gods up there somewhere who go, no, no, no. There's things you got to get through, right? When I was coaching baseball, I go, guys, we can work on the mechanics, we can this, we can that, but at the end of the day, it's in the hands of the baseball gods. It felt that way with some of this. So
Yep.
sure enough, after 7 or 8 years of having some really good years, the company that we were depending on for the analysis, the company that we were depending on, quite frankly, to make the right recommendations to our clients, COVID hit. It really nailed our analyst team. It really nailed the suppliers. The last thing they were doing was getting customer service people that would talk to more people and so things that had been taking us a couple months to get information on were taking us a year. And in many cases, you couldn't get these people to talk to these people. We had a deal that we were working on with an $80 billion company that wanted us to look at telecom for some of their clients. It would have been worth millions, but we couldn't get the right, well, I say we, our franchisor could not get the people we needed in front of them
Oh man.
to close the deal.
So here's one of the questions I have, learning from your experience, because I'm looking at potentially being a franchisee. I listened to Shaquille O'Neal, an interview with him the other day. I know
Mhm.
many people do this. He's like, I own 35 Kentucky Fried Chickens. I own 50 McDonald's. I own 107 whatever. And
Mhm.
he's obviously not the one who's there. He has people who are over it. But my question, and so I'm looking at that potentially being something there. So that's why I'm so interested in this.
Mhm.
Looking back, what would you have done differently? Was it something from the beginning that you would have chosen a different franchisor? You would have chosen this differently? You would have done this different? What would you have done differently looking back?
Right. And that's kind of a loaded question because stuff just happens. I mean, there are
Sure.
lots of things I probably would have tweaked. I'd have probably gone after a different. I'd have gone after different types of clients sooner, but that's part of the process. Um, but how do you predict COVID? How do you
Yeah.
predict, a hiring crush, particularly since, where my analysts were was in a country that was even more impacted than the US. Um,
Gotcha.
so sometimes there's just intangibles where you go, I don't know, drum up more customers, one thing or another. Uh, Hindsight being 2020, I probably would have looked at something where more of the variables were locked in. I mean, the point of buying a franchise is that you minimize the number of variables. Shaq can have 35 Kentucky Fried Chickens because any idiot can run the location.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I'm not, don't, you know,
We get what you're saying. It's the
yeah, if
process
you're a
is set.
McDonald's owner or KFC owner or whatever, you go, yeah, I'll show you idiot who's the idiot, right? No.
Yeah.
But what I mean is, most of the variables are taken out. So all it is putting bodies in place because they've made it that turnkey. They've made it that precise.
And so would you have, like, let's say that you did another franchise, you're like, today starting now I want to do a franchise again. Would you go more towards the turnkey, more towards Kentucky Fried Chicken, or more towards what you did before, or somewhere in the middle? Where would you say you would want to be?
Hmm. And actually, in asking that question that way, you kind of gave me some answers to the question that you asked the first time. So again, we'll edit this and do however we do for it now. But so the questions that I asked when I bought this franchise were, what do they do that no one else does? For my customers, what do they bring to the table for me that I can't do for myself? Now, those questions are still valuable, but probably more than anything else, in terms of what I was doing versus what I might do in the future, is there a ready market of people just dying for the service?
Mm,
So that essentially I'm not having to convince anyone of anything. The thing about third party expense reduction is no one had ever heard of the company that did the work for us, which really was neither here nor there. But it also meant that we didn't have any name recognition, and we didn't have the credibility that went with it. And the other side of it is we had people when you go, hey, we're going to save you a ton of money, and then we're going to split it with you. Well, if I took two 20s out of an envelope and said, look, I'll give you one of the 20s, or I'll give you two 20s as long as you give me back one, that's a no-brainer, right?
yeah.
But when you've got a CFO who's going, wait a minute, expense reduction is my job, and if he shows a lot of return here, I'm going to look like an idiot. Start putting egos into play and all of this other thing, and it just wasn't
Gotcha.
cut and dried. But my point is, if I have to educate my people about why they need me, I'm fighting an uphill battle I really don't need to.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have to convince anybody that they want to come dance. Now, you might have to convince the guy that, hey, this is what your wife or your girlfriend really wants for you. And, trust me, life's going to go so much better for you if she's happy. Okay, I get that one, right? But what you do is what you do, and people recognize it. At KFC, McDonald's, Burger King, whoever, I know what I'm getting.
Yeah.
I have name recognition. I have credibility. I have all of these things. Now, the downside of something that's already popular is, all right, am I going to be competing with myself or competing with the rest of their people? Is there enough room for me? Now, most of these companies have done enough research that they know, and so that's not necessarily an issue. But if you look at the top 15, let's say food franchises today, and say what were the top 15 10 years ago, half of them are gone, or half of them are going away.
Sure.
And all you've got to do is look around and see when was the last time they remodeled, when was the last time they updated, and you know in a heartbeat which ones are functional and which aren't. I
For
mean, the
sure.
retailer I worked for, that was larger than anyone else in the world 45 years ago, well, 40 plus years ago,
Sure.
hardly exists now. And the one that was up and coming 40 years ago is now experiencing the same issues that one was then.
Yeah.
So, yes, bigger is not always better. Established is not always where you want to be.
How
So,
many? One question I had is how many franchisees did the franchise have when you joined?
roughly 120.
Okay, so it wasn't like they had seven.
No,
They had a really good amount.
no, and they've had a 20, 25-year track record.
Okay. Okay.
And so, now were they growing, expanding phenomenally well? No. And that probably should have been something that I researched more heavily.
Yeah.
And when you go, what would you have done differently? I'd have probably researched things a little better. Now, having said that, I mean, 5 years later, knowing what I know, is that still potentially viable? Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is I'm not sure that the research would have been what would have changed it.
Sure.
Because this is almost one you had to go wade up to your guts in before you realized. And don't get me wrong, there's people that still viably do that. In fact, with what I do now, I still work with a third party expense reduction company, not that one, that actually brings me leads so that I can look at things in terms of the developers and property owners.
Gotcha.
I don't do expense reduction. I'm actually in the telecom industry, but I use them for leads because we're a good source of savings for them and for their clients. But point being, yeah, do your research. Call the franchisees. If I think by law franchisors have to give you a list, but even then, it wouldn't take much to Google. Here's 20,
And
within
let me
this
talk to the
geography.
franchisees.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and have those interviews. Do with them what you're doing with me.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think about it, I remember telling. You know a little of our backstory, but between my wife and I, because it's not either her or I's first marriage. I brought 7 kids in, she brought 6. So we have 6 sons and 7 daughters between the two of us. And I've got to have conversations with every one of my daughters when they were in that dating stage and going, I said, you take more time deciding where you're going to go eat than you do deciding on who your boyfriend's going to be. And they look at it like, oh, ha, ha, they laugh. And then I go, no, seriously.
Yeah.
If the meal's bad, you can spit it out. You call it good, no big deal, right? You're not married to that cheeseburger for the rest of your life. Well, that's how we should approach business.
For sure.
Now, you can overanalyze things to the point, what do they call it?
Analysis
Analysis
paralysis, right?
Yeah. You can overdo it, particularly if you're cutting edge. Who would have advised Bill Gates to do what he did?
Mm-hmm.
Or Steve Jobs or any of these others. So there's something to be said for the one that just says, look, we can do this and we want to do it because, and then lo and behold, here comes the market, right? Who'd have thought social media would exist the way it does?
Yep.
But for every one of those opportunities, there's 20 or 25 in providing basic goods and services, even if they're new goods and services, to either an existing market or a new market. And it's who's my competition, who's doing what well. With what I do now, I'll be flying up to Denver in a couple of weeks and sitting down with a major developer, and it's all about the conversation. What do you do now? What's working? What's not working? And then we'll have a discussion about whether or not I can bring anything to bear that's different. Same conversation when you're talking about going into business.
Yeah.
What am I trying to accomplish? Who's already out there? What do they do well and not well? So is there a place for me? Does
Yeah.
that make sense? And then
No, yeah,
beyond
for
that,
sure.
can this franchise deliver the goods? Or can I get the financing on my own, the tutoring on my own, and all of those other things to make it happen?
For sure. That totally makes sense.
Which brings us into a different place when it comes to, let's say you're not doing a franchise. Let's say, hey, I just want to get out, I want a restaurant, or, I want to open a store, I want to, open a dance place, I want to this, I want to that. All right, what things do I need that I'm not the expert on? Well, you can spend a ton of time trying to learn those things, or you can quite frankly hire them out, because one of the beauties of this explosion of information, and one of the things that have come out of COVID, is the ability to do what you and I do. Now, granted, we're only 4 blocks from each other, but I could be doing this if you were in Toronto, Canada.
Yep.
And so the proliferation of third party auditors, the proliferation of someone who just specializes in helping people hire,
Sure.
or doing books, or marketing. I mean, you've only been approached by 30 marketers and nobody even knows you're out there, right? But have the humility to recognize what you're not good at and subcontract it.
For sure.
I had a conversation 2 weeks ago with a very very talented marketer. In fact, he and I had conversations. We're still kind of having conversations about whether or not it would make sense for me to come on as a COO, CFO type of scenario on a contracted basis or whatever. But when we first started having those conversations, it was, why do you want that? Well, I'm pulling a staff together. Why? Well, because I want to grow. Okay, so who's going to train these people? IT people, if you will. Well, I can't. Exactly. And yet they'll be your employees, and they'll get to know the ins and outs of your business. And then if one of them gets hit by a bus or quits or dies or whatever, you're toast.
Yeah.
Do not subcontract out the IT, or better yet, align yourself with someone who already has those skills. And he says, well, I need to bring somebody in on the phones. Why? Whether you're using domestic VAs, whether you're using foreign, virtual assistants, can they give you what you want at a fraction of the price, because you don't have to stick them in an office? Anyhow, by the time we got through going through the 4 or 5 different areas of his business that he would have had to hire for, I basically talked myself out of a job, because now there was going to be no one for me to pull all these pieces together.
Yeah.
Or I could have done it on 5 hours a week, because I simply would have been coordinating the activities of all of these experts.
Yeah.
And so he figured out that he could coordinate the activities of all of those experts at a fraction of the cost. In fact, he ultimately found someone that he was already working with for certain services that would contract out all of those other services with him. So he and I bump into each other at a theater 2 weeks ago. He said, Craig, he says, I'm keeping everything that's coming in, because they just take it out of my percentages when I do business for them.
So getting into that makes a lot of sense of how you got into it, the investment, choosing some of the things that you would do differently now, like researching the company, going into selling the franchise. How does that work? Do you own 80% of that franchise or 50%? How does that work?
Everything, and there are mechanics involved. So I'm going to answer the question on 2 levels. And the first is, do you have anything to sell?
Sure.
I mean, at the end of the day, if you're hemorrhaging cash, you're closing the doors. And you'll see this a lot. I mean, former presidential candidate, current senator for Utah, Romney, right? Part of a venture capitalist group. They would buy up companies that had potential, and they'd either cut up the pieces and sell it off, or they would bring the right management in to supplement the right ideas, and you'd move it on. Typically, companies either have an idea man or they have an implement. You need both. So if you're not one or the other, when you're looking to sell, you're trying to find the guy. So you've got this great idea, you've grown it to what you can, and now you're looking for someone to buy it. And we see a lot of that in the market. The tech industry is huge on it. One example that I could use, a company called Divi 4 years ago, they were just starting out. They were recently purchased by Bill.com for $4 or $5 billion in 4 years. Well,
Wow.
why would you allow that to take place? Well, one, you had grown to the level of your competence and then some. But there was also complementary markets, all kinds of different things. And so it made sense. But the point is, they sold knowing that they had the right product, but they now needed someone that was already where they wanted to be to execute it to the next level. And it's not uncommon when you do that kind of a buyout for you to stay on for 4 or 5 years as either a consultant or the sales manager or whatever your skill set happened to be, that now dovetails into whatever they're trying to do. And like I say, you see that a lot in these businesses that are innovative, because you have guys that are serial entrepreneurs, so they'll bring it to a certain level and then sell it to a company that is capable of them developing it. So you have that. And there are actually, where I want to get into the mechanics of that, is if you're looking to sell a company at all, I mean, if you were going to sue somebody for whatever reason, you'd go consult with a lawyer, would you not?
Yeah.
I mean, you're not going to handle this one yourself. There are companies out there that specialize in exiting. And, one, they'll come in and help you make your company more profitable over 6 months and then help you sell it. And then they're going to take a percentage just like a realtor would.
What are those? Because I know there are business brokers. Are you talking about something different?
Yeah, they're not a business broker, but there are actually companies that will help you turnkey your business in a way that it's viable, if you will. Right? You've got this great idea, but your profitability is not there. So they'll help you fix your profitability so that I think one of the companies is called Fit to Exit. But I know one in Canada that he specializes in helping them with all their employee manuals and all of their company literature so that they're positioned either to grow themselves or now they look much more presentable, to a buyer.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
you would want to involve an expert. I mean, unless in Raina and I's case, because of the way we were locked in with the franchise, we could sell it to another franchisee within the system. We could sell it to an outside franchisee. And I actually had people that were going, Craig, we really want to look at this. But because of where we were with it and what I saw in terms of the company trends, I actually went with them and said, no, you don't.
Mm-hmm.
You do not, yes, I could have financed them. They could have bought out the remaining portion of my contract, could have done a lot of things, but I didn't feel integrous, if you will, of trying to convince them that I had this bright, shiny, piece of gold, when in fact it was, at that point, for me, it was cosmetic jewelry.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Do you feel that same way selling it to another franchisee?
I would not. And we looked at that but there were different restrictions in terms of approvals and one thing or another. So a couple of us floated it back and forth, but they weren't, the numbers weren't all that good. And so ultimately I sold it back to the franchisor.
Okay. And
so
how does that work when you own a franchise? Do you own 80% of it? Is it a separate entity? How does that work?
Every franchise is different, but
Okay.
in most franchises you have zero ownership in the franchisor, right?
Sure.
In the parent company, if you
Sure.
will, right?
Sure.
Doesn't exist. Now, the percent, I owned 100% of conceptual consulting doing business as blah, blah, blah. But what I owned was essentially the revenue generation.
Okay. So you
Right?
created your own entity, your own
Yes.
legal entity. You own
Mhm.
100% of it. You own the legal 100% and the financial 100%. You don't own any of the franchisor
Right.
parent company. And then when you sell the company, you're selling your entity, which is separate from the parent company.
Right.
But
Subject
they
to,
can say who you can sell it to and who you can't. And
yeah,
in this case, they
subject
said
to
you could sell it to
franchisor.
basically anybody.
So, and that's the upside downside, call it what you will. And that's one thing is always look at what is, what's the exit strategy? And
Yeah.
does the franchise actually have a pattern where 5 years, 10 years down the road, you're able to resell, you're able to exit profitably? But it's always going to come down to this. And I don't care who the franchise is or whether it's your own entity from start to finish. What's in it for someone else? Do I have exceptional revenue and they're looking to buy my revenue stream? Do I have incredible goodwill and unrealized potential, in which case somebody's going to pay more for the business than you're currently generating, and they'll call that blue sky.
Yeah.
So I either have an idea that has incredible potential, or I have an existing revenue stream that somebody's willing to put the work into and just want to take it over so that I can take an early retirement or move on to something else or whatever. But you've got to demonstrate value that someone else is willing to pay for. And
Yeah.
then that's why these business and like I say, they're not business brokers per se, though business brokers will typically know these fit to exit type companies that will actually prepare you for exit. Do you have legal documents in place? Are you transferring intellectual property? How good are your employees and what kind of contracts or non-competes are they tied to? Is this survivable? I mean, are you the person that holds it all together? Remember we talked earlier about this place would die without me? If you're trying to sell a place that would die without you, you got nothing beyond what you're willing to put into it, but you really don't have any way of escaping.
Mm.
I talked to, and this is way, way, way back in my career. I was early 30s, and I had somebody that wanted to sell me their greenhouse operation. Now, he was doing radio shows on a bi-weekly basis. He was doing extension lectures for the county extension service, in addition to doing all kinds of in-house training. And I was helping him with a lot of that. But he's going, Craig, buy the place. And I'm like, you got 4 kids. He says, yeah, but the 2 that I want to run it won't. And the 2 that I don't want anywhere near it want it. So I'm going to sell it to you. And the point was, okay, Dick, if we did something like that, I would need 5 years of you transferring your credibility. For the first year, I'll be a guest on your show, and you'll still come in and do, monthly clinics. You'll still this, you'll still that, so that by the end of that 5 years, you have transferred you because you're the value of what you have.
Yeah.
It isn't your greenhouses, it's not your plants, and it's not the chemicals on the shelf. You are the brand.
Yep.
So anytime you're looking at selling a business or doing whatever you want to do, decide where the value is and how you would transfer that to a potential buyer.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I really like how you said basically the factors of selling are, 1, the potential of the business, either you have an idea or goodwill or something, and then 2, your revenue stream or your profit that you've been able to show. My last question is, how long did the process of the sale of the business take? Because I know you sold it back to the franchisor, so it seems like that would be rather simple. But how did that process look?
We went through 2 or 3 months of deciding, I mean, here's how much the revenue stream we have coming in will be worth to them. If we're not paying the percentage, they're getting the whole thing. How much effort is it going to take for them to do it? Are they going to try to just resell it to another franchisee? What kind of investments have we already made ahead that we want back? So it was really a matter of figuring out who has what money that belongs to you, and that took 2 or 3 months, and we were able to basically get that done fairly clean. Doesn't always work out that way.
For sure.
I'm working with several developers now that are in the process of trying to buy other pieces of property that may or may not already be partially developed. And 6 months, a year later, they're still trying to get it done. So I'd love to say, this all happens in this period of time. It all depends.
Yeah, that's why I've heard the average sale kind of takes between like 6 to 12 months of time if you're looking to
The
sell your
more
business.
decision makers you have in the process, the more money that's at stake. Typically, the longer it's going to take. I was telling you about that client that we were saving them 30, 40, 50,000 a month, right? That one from start to finish took a year. Now, wait a minute.
Wow.
It's just simple. Let me figure out if I can save you money. And we negotiated over the percentage. We negotiated over the time, the terms of the contract. We went back and forth on a dozen things.
Yeah.
In my current stuff that I'm doing, got a 250-acre project going in northern Colorado. Our part of it's pretty simple when all is said and done into getting signatures, even though we've already agreed in concept what it needs to look like.
Yeah.
We finally now have the final documents. What we've all agreed to is now on paper, now in the hands of their lawyers for redlining and renegotiation and back and forth. But we're 6 months in.
Yeah.
So
Did you?
I think that there is a clean, here's how much time it will take you.
No, for sure. Did you try to sell to, I know you said it was kind of on the radar of selling to another franchisee. Did you go through the process of trying to do that, or did you ultimately just decide, you know what, it's just going to be easier if we just sell it to the franchisor?
I actually talked to a couple, but we weren't in that phase where it was, this is the hard number. But we were both familiar enough with what their business was and my business was, and who are the clients that are still 1 year into their contract, 2 years into their contract, ones that are about to be done. We could talk about what the revenue stream to them might be.
Yeah.
Geographically, none of them, the ones that were in a position to buy, weren't close enough to service it.
Sure.
And so that's where we ultimately went, okay, we'll go back to the Zori.
I do have one last question if we can, and this is, it might be getting too far into the weeds, but maybe if you can just answer it on the surface. With the contract between you as the franchisee and them as the franchisor, you promise to do certain things, right? They promise to do certain things. In this specific case, they're the ones who are fulfilling, and you're the one who's selling. And in that case of the big company, what was it, $100 billion company or some crazy number?
$8 billion company. Yeah, only $8 billion.
Only. The franchisor wasn't able to fulfill on their end of the bargain. Now,
right.
What is the and I know there's a big question to answer, but basically, what are the ramifications if they're not able to produce on what you signed up as a franchisee because they said they were going to produce? So what are the ramifications there when they can't or when they don't?
Yeah. Every franchise is different. Now, we had situations where we were negotiating for clients, and based on that inability to fulfill, they could cancel the contract. Well, there's a big difference between canceling a contract and recovering damages, if you will, right?
Yeah.
So in this scenario, based on how the contracts were written, There was not a legal recourse on fulfillment. So, and shame on me, for again, you say, is there anything you would do differently? I would have done more due diligence.
Yeah.
Now, having said that, I don't know how much difference it would have made because it felt like the right thing to do. And quite frankly, we were doing well. I mean, it was a combination of several things all hitting at once. And I'm not going to say, hey, and you'll hear franchisees, franchisors, it'll boil down to everybody calls them Z's or Zors, right?
Okay.
So in this case, was the Zor being deceptive? No. Was there malice? Probably not. But the biggest thing is based on the way the contracts were written, there wasn't any enforceability.
Gotcha.
So, and that's the, anytime you get into court, well, I've got to prove the damages. All right. Well, there was nothing on paper yet beyond, well, the lawyers on both sides need to look at this and make sure that we've got some testimonials, we've got this, we've got that. So establishing very clearly that this sale would have taken place and these are the losses because it didn't, highly conjecture, right? And let's face it, the burden of proof in court is huge when you're asking for damages.
For sure.
And quite frankly, with this particular situation, I'm not sure we could have recovered even if the courts had awarded it.
For sure. Or even because court's one thing, and that's kind of last case. Like, usually don't want to go to the courts. Like, I can see that there are cases where you would need to, but even in the contract, if it's like, hey, if you're not able to do this, then you reward us damages, and it's not you take us to court, and I don't know, maybe there could be something like that where if I'm looking to get into a franchise with somebody, then I say, hey, if you don't produce, if I'm running McDonald's and you don't have the food there, then there has to be some damages where it's clearly marked out what I receive, because I'm gonna be hanging out to dry, and I'm the one.
What you're describing is a process that I now know is called redlining, and I hadn't realized it, but I did when I looked at the contract originally. Go, wait a minute, you're telling me that I can't collect fees from a merchant service provider that I was under contract with prior to this, and they owe me money. And he went, well, we're trying to maintain independence. I said, well, I get that, and I would never recommend them again for anything. But that's not the point. They owe me residuals on this, and this. So he redlined the contract in that area so that it excluded my ability to receive compensation while still generally protecting this independence that was necessary for us to make recommendations, because we took no kickbacks.
Gotcha.
Because this was a pre-existing scenario, it didn't influence that process. So, but you're right. What you're describing is called redlining, and I would, anytime anybody's looking at a contract to start a business, I don't care if it's a landlord that you're doing it yourself with. I don't care if it's a franchise situation. Get that in the hands of a competent attorney and and have them go over it.
Yeah.
And where you want changes made, don't be afraid to do that.
Yeah.
They want to sell you as franchise as much as you want to buy it, probably more so. So make sure that things work out to yours. I mean, the worst they can do is say no.
Thank you so much for sitting down and going through this. I learned a lot. I'm new to kind of the whole franchise world, so I just have so many different questions. And I think a lot of people as well don't understand it, and I think it's a very viable business. Either if you're just getting started into it and you don't have an idea yourself, and you want to use the system that somebody else has already built, or if you've already built stuff like Shaquille O'Neal or some of these other guys that have lots of money, and they're like, I want to have some assets. I have lots of cash. I need some assets. Let me get some franchises. So I just really appreciate sitting down with you.
No sweat. One thing it just came to mind, and what this is, there's a book called The E Myth, and then The E Myth Revisited. That one will probably do more for talking to you about why you would or wouldn't franchise, either franchising the business you have out and becoming a Zor, or buying a franchise and becoming a Z.
Mm.
And so I'd highly recommend you read that book before you make any decisions beyond what you do with the company you have or whether you jump into something else.
It's one of my favorite books. I love that book.
Okay.
Somebody recommended it. I asked this successful guy maybe like 7 years ago. I was like, "What's the one book you've learned in business that's helped you more?" And he said, "E Myth." And so I listened to it, and I probably listened to it maybe 7 or 8 times. So
Okay,
I can totally test. It's on like top 5 books.
sweet. So I hope this was of value to you.
Yeah, yeah, a lot of value, and I'm
I
sure
mean, I never
everybody
have
that's
gotten shit mouth off, so I hope this worked for you.
no, definitely that's what I'm here for, and I think that everybody that's going to watch this is going to get a lot of value out of it as well.
If you really enjoyed this interview, click right here to watch more. If you want some business tips, click right here.